Hey, I'm Ryan Canelli, and today we're going to do something really cool and a modification that should have been done from 67 to 72 on all the C&K trucks. We're going to add a trip meter to the speedometer, so stay tuned. I think the first thing we should do is talk about how the Speedo works. So you've got a drive input coming in the back, and then you've got this bell with a magnet, and as that magnet passes, it tries to overcome a spring pressure, which then moves the needle. So let's check it out. The drill will be your Speedo gear on your transmission. Here we go. Then it falls back, and if you watch carefully, you'll see the numbers turn on the odometer. Alright, so what we're going to do is we're going to pull all the guts out of this case, and we're going to install the Corvette Speedo. Now check this out. The Corvette Speedo has the odometer on the top and the trip meter on the bottom, and it's got a cable on the back. And now this cable, when you push the button, if you watch closely, the cable will engage the gear, and then it will turn the trip meter. Very clever. And if you want to reset one gear at a time, you can turn it back. So I know one of the questions you're going to have is, why don't you just put the Corvette Speedo in my hand right in the C10 opening? The reason you can't do that, and they look amazingly similar, is the wrong kind of Speedo cable. But that's not really the issue. The big issue is the Speedo, hold that thought, is 160 mile an hour speedometer, and the trucks are 100 mile an hour speedometer. That means that at 80 or 90, our Speedo is only going to be going about 30 or 40, so it's going to be kind of messed up. That all comes down to the timing inside this bell. So one of the things we're going to have to do is, if you see this little clip right here is riveted on, notice there's the rivets but there's no clip, we're going to have to steal this clip off of here and put it on here so that we can make sure that this anti-slip device doesn't go rotating around and the numbers don't go haywire. So that's going to be one of our first projects. Alright, in order to keep all these parts together, I'm going to take this little magnetic tray and I'm going to put pieces in there and I'll separate them into groups. So here we go. So that's pretty much it for disassembling the Corvette Speedo. Let's take apart the C10 Speedo next. So as we talked about this earlier, we got to get the anti-rotation devices off the Corvette Speedo and onto the C10 Speedo. Now be careful about the orientation of these, because if you put them in the wrong spot, they won't line up with the odometer or the trip, and the numbers will go haywire. So keep watching. To remove the anti-rotation devices, all I did was get up into the corner with a screwdriver and pry them off of there. The rivets aren't set very well, so you'll be able to pop them right off. Now they're going to get distorted, so be prepared to have to straighten them back out. Once you get them off, you'll notice that they don't just fit right over the rivets, and you're going to have to do a little work with some pliers on the rivets to make sure that you can set those things down into place. We'll get to that in a minute. Alright, so after a little fiddling around, these two are very, very similar, but this one has a notch in it. And I'm not exactly sure what the notch is for. You wouldn't need it on either part. So I stole this off the Corvette, and I'm going to put it here on the C10. So last one was a dry build just to see if everything worked. It's going to live right there. This time we're going to add a little bit of do not eat to glue that in place to make sure. Okay, so let's let that dry up, and in the morning we'll assemble this all back together, and we'll talk about tearing apart your cluster to install this new part. Alright, so it turns out that you have to remove both of these. So once you knock the rivets off, it's hard to close them back up, so an additional amount of super glue will hold that thing in place. And it really can't escape because these are now dowels holding that thing from moving forwards or backwards. But really what it's doing, it's stopping those little keys on your tumblers from escaping. That way that thing keeps time. So now let's get this thing into the console. Alright, so you gotta remember that when you're mixing and matching parts, some things just aren't gonna like each other because they've probably been married together for 50 or more years. So what I ended up with was I tried to use the Corvette numbers that were all black. I ended up using the original 72 C10 out of the speedometer and the 72 C10 drive gear. So the reason I tried to use the other one is because it had a helical path and it looked a little more modern from the 70s. I thought maybe it would last longer, but let's go ahead and watch those numbers spin then. Sorry about the drill, it's not the most optimal way to spin this, but you get the point. So all of that works. Now we just have to get it stuffed back into the console, and we got to cut this hole. Okay, so if you look at the bolt pattern, this aftermarket speedometer has a different bolt pattern bolting the face to the cover, so I'm going to have to drill those holes. But if you look at the odometer hole in the 67 Chevy, the hole is wider, right? Because it was an odometer and not a trip meter. What I'm going to do is I have to transfer this hole to this panel. So how am I going to do that? I'm going to do it on the back. So I'm going to use this template and I'm going to drill those holes so that I can put the vintage speedometer in my modern cluster and add the odometer hole, which will now be on the top, and the trip hole will shine through there. But one thing you're going to notice is you will probably get additional light coming through that hole because the panel is bigger. So I've heard guys take electrical tape and make a little shield on each side so that you can reduce that light pollution coming through your gauge. We'll start with that hole first. Now you can see now I have a template to cut these holes out. And if you notice, it'll be just a touch small. I can sneak up on it with a file. So let's put this in the drill press and see what happens. Okay, so I've cut the hole, I've painted the hole, and I painted all the scratch marks that I made while I was filing on it. So I used electrical tape to go around the edges to make sure I got a nice crisp, clean, like 30 thou worth of paint on the affected areas. So I will peel this out and we'll bolt it on the speedometer. Okay, with the exception of the additional Speedo holes, because we're using an aftermarket part, I don't think you'd be able to really figure out what we did here. So let's go ahead and line these guys up. So if you look real close, you'll notice that there's an air gap right around the trip meter. And so we don't want light pollution coming in. So we're gonna add a little electrical tape right behind there as sort of a faux finish so that it closes up that gap. That's next. Okay, if you look real close, you can see the electrical tape just peeping through there, right? Flip it over the back. So I put a piece facing this direction towards us, and I put a piece facing the metal to hold it together. And now let's see if we can't put that together. I think that should solve our light pollution problem. Let's put it together. Okay, the aftermarket Speedo got me again. So we thought we'd bypassed all of the cool stuff that it took to get in there by putting an OEM speedometer in there. Turns out they changed the shaft size for the needle. So I got a little silicone inside the needle, holding it there, making its own little casting, and I'll come back in an hour and see what that does. In the meanwhile, I have a whole other project, which is to get the trip meter cable out to the front where you'll be able to access it and use it. So let's see what happens next. Okay, with a little bit of movie magic, I've taken the back of the Corvette Speedo and I've hogged it down. And this, if you look at it, was all of this, but it had this feature, which is missing. I drilled this hole while you guys weren't looking, and I'm going to use the Speedo to hold this in place, and that should make it so the cable will have a home to operate the gears. So we got to put that on. Next thing we got to do is we got to figure out where the cable is going to poke through. I have to drill through here and have that thing exposed out to the front so we'll be able to operate it. Let's see what happens. This turned out to be way harder than I thought. Where I located this doesn't like the angle that this is at, and so I read in the article that the guy had used a 64 Corvette cable because it was a little longer, and I thought, I could probably beat this. Apparently he was right, so I'm gonna have to order a cable, and we are on hold until I can get a cable, so see you in a couple days. All right, so we had to take some backtracking. This bracket that I made to hang on to the other cable is not going to work. The new cable that I got that's longer ended up being 3/8 fine thread instead of 5/16 fine thread, so this is out of the picture. I went back to the internet and kind of found that guys have been drilling and tapping the Speedo housing at a slight angle to make this cable go right into the housing. So I had to make more clearance in this area here, and I had to kind of readjust everything because the cable was bigger and it didn't go through. If you look, I've got a hole here and it didn't go through that either. So it was kind of back to the drawing board there for a little bit. So let's see what happens if this will all assemble again. All right, so first things first, let's stack some of these items on here to reduce the amount of stuff I'm working with. Let's start with this guy. We're like halfway there now, right? So then let's take this guy. Let's lay that on there. This is where it gets complicated. So I'm gonna put this on here. So that's down. Now let's see if we can push that cable through without making everything upset. This is so far kind of working out. So I'm gonna do a flip. See where these holes line up. What's upset? Hey, look at that. That wasn't half bad. So cable goes through here. I'm going to stuff a grommet in here. I might put a dab of silicone around there to keep the dust out. Let's get these screws started. Okay, let's see what we got from the front. finish with this knob. Right? What do you think of that? Alright, so we actually got the trip meter to work. So a couple of learnings here, and I thought I would share them with you. Is number one, if a cranky old guy on the internet tells you need some parts, go ahead and order those parts because you're going to need those parts. Number two, if you got a little bit of skills and a lot of tenacity, you can get through any project. And number three, if it's not broke, don't fix it. And the reason I say that is really, did I actually need that trip meter? No, not really. All the new smartphones have these great telemetry and tracking devices. You pretty much can do all of that on your phone, and you don't have to tear up the dash in your vintage car. So, last but not least, I have to mention rule number 4. Don't sit down eating the ice cream out of the container because you will eat the whole thing. So, with that, I'm out of here.